of countries, nations, economies, cultures in the world of the late 20th century. And for most of us, it is a daily experience. We buy clothing from China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Mexico. We practice yoga, which came from India. We eat food from Ethiopia, the Middle East, Latin America. We practice meditation that also derived from India. We get income, some of us, from international investments. And of course, all of us get news from around the world all the time. So we live in this globalized world. Now, globalization was presented to us as the term emerged as something novel and unprecedented. The world was becoming, in this point of view, the world was becoming a single interacting place, and human consciousness had entered a new stage. And human connectedness and human consciousness were now both global. Now, about all of this, historians are not quite so sure. Historians are prone to trace back quite a number of things that appear novel at the time. So today, I'd like to, acting as a historian, to cast contemporary globalization in a much larger historical framework. It begins with a number of ancient processes that operated on a global scale, three of them in particular. The first, of course, is the peopling of the planet. This is a process that took place over hundreds of thousands of years. It probably began in Africa around 250,000 years ago, and human beings emerged out of Africa and found their way to the rest of the world. And the last place to receive human settlement was New Zealand, only about 1,200 years ago or so. A second global process that occurred in ancient times is agriculture. Agriculture, it turns out, was invented or discovered independently on every continent. The green spaces there show the places where agriculture developed earliest. They occurred in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia. Not really in Europe, although it spread there from these various points of origin. And a third early process that was global in its extent was the development of what we now call civilizations. These are human societies that are based in cities and organized around a state of some kind. And these too developed independently in each major geographical area of the world. There's a couple of places in the Americas, the Nile Valley in Africa, the Indus River Valley, the Tigris-Euphrates, and Chinese civilization. So all of these processes, the peopling of the planet, the development of agriculture, the emergence of civilizations, all of these were global in their extent. In addition to that, there were a number of ancient commercial networks, trading patterns that broadly resemble contemporary globalization, although they were not nearly as extensive. The first is what we refer to as the Silk Roads. It went from China to the Mediterranean area over somewhere between 500 BCE and 1500. So it lasted for a couple thousand years. These trading operations took place via camel caravans on the Silk Roads. These caravans stopped at places known as caravanserais all along the route, where they rested their animals and picked up new products and sold things. These are some of the things that were traded along the Silk Road, but the main one, of course, was silk itself, from which it got its name. Silk became a currency in many parts of the world. It was used as a means of payment. Within Islamic and Christian cultures, it became associated with the sacred. By the 12th century, a West African king of an ancient state called Ghana was wearing silk clothes. And in the Roman Empire, silk became kind of controversial, partly because it drained the currency that the Romans had. They were paying so much for the silk that ultimately came from China that some people were feeling critical about this. And in a moral sense, there were interesting complaints that women wearing silk, that their bodies were exposed to the gaze of men who were not their husbands. And so there was some objection to this kind of thing. The Silk Roads, of course, carried more than silk and more than products, but Buddhism spread widely throughout the Silk Road network. These are some famous Buddhist paintings from Dunhuang, which is in Western China, where there were a whole bunch of caves established. In the 20th century, they have been uncovered and to some extent restored. They were frescoes and sculptures such as these that simply illustrate the spread of Buddhism across the Silk Road network. But of course, diseases also spread across that network, especially the plague in the Black Death, which began in China, spread across the Silk Road network, and arrived in Europe and the Middle East with devastating effects in both places. Now, paralleling the Silk Road networks was another network that we can call the sea roads. It took place not so much over land, but over sea, as these illustrations show. And it was an immense trading network that encompassed China, Southeast Asia, India, East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and it was a parallel and was operating at more or less the same time as the Silk Road network. The high point was probably between 600 and 1450, and it was stimulated by what was happening in China. China's population was growing, and its economy was growing, so that the sea roads represented a way for Chinese products to reach many parts of the world. It is said that in Swahili civilization along the east coast of Africa, that people were dining on Chinese porcelain and wearing Indian cotton cloth. And of course, the sea roads were also associated with the spread of religions, as Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and to a more limited extent, Christianity also expanded across the sea roads network. These are some of the products that were exchanged in the Indian Ocean basin. A third major commercial network in ancient times was what I'm calling the sand roads. It is trans-Saharan commerce that linked the interior of West Africa with the world of North Africa and the Mediterranean. It was made possible by camels. They were introduced, and it was camel-owning peoples from the oases of the deserts that became the major traders on this Silk Road network. It stimulated the growth of states, cities, and civilizations in West Africa, and it also facilitated the expansion of Islam across the Sahara Desert into West Africa. This is a contemporary version of a mosque at Djenné, which is in the West African state of Mali. And the first mosque on this site was in the 13th century. This is a more recent version. Now, all of these ancient commercial networks bear some resemblance to contemporary globalization. However, there are also a lot of differences. At that time, most people still produced what they needed by themselves, for themselves. Now, almost nobody does that. Furthermore, back then, during the time of these trading networks, far fewer people sold their own labor on the market. Most people worked for themselves rather than working for wages with an employer. Now, practically everybody sells their labor on the marketplace. And a much narrower range of goods. Mostly in these ancient times, it was luxury goods because they fetched a price that could support these trading endeavors. And of course, these ancient trading networks were primarily regional, not global. And that is what began to change in the early modern era. Historians refer to the early modern era as roughly the 3 centuries between 1500 and 1800. And during these centuries, one of the new things that happened was that Europeans began to enter Asian trade directly. They had not done that before. You're probably familiar from high school history courses with Vasco da Gama, who made his way around the southern part of Africa and into Asia in, I think it was 1894, somewhere around 1500. And what the Europeans created in this Indian Ocean area was not primarily colonies. There were a few areas where they did exercise political control, especially the Dutch in Sumatra, the Spanish in the Philippines, and the Portuguese, particularly here in what is now the Congo. But for the most part, what they established was trading posts. So these have come to be called trading post empires, in which the Europeans did not control people or territory, but they controlled the trading routes along which goods moved. And you can see here the European trading ports that were established during this period of time. Far more important than that, however, was the incorporation of the Americas into global commerce. And that, of course, occurred via conquest, colonization, and large-scale European settlement in the Americas. And as I mentioned last time, it was associated with this massive exchange of goods, of animals, of plants, of crops, across the Atlantic Ocean. And of course, this was also accompanied by a massive demographic catastrophe in the Americas as European germs and diseases accompanied by conquest and violence simply decimated the native populations of the Americas. Now, also in this early modern period, new forms of global commerce came into existence. One of them was the silver trade. Silver was discovered more or less at the same time, big deposits of it in Latin America, particularly in Bolivia and in Japan. And somebody made the comment that during this time, silver went round the world and made the world go around. So the circulation of silver in the long run benefited China more than any place else. The Chinese in 1570 demanded that people pay their taxes in silver rather than in products. So that meant there was a great demand for silver, and silver fetched a high price. So most of the world's silver gravitated to China, where it was in great demand. But silver also meant catastrophe for those who mined it. This is a scene from Potosi, which is one of the main silver mines in what is now Bolivia. It is said that the people who entered, that the families of people who entered the silver mines as workers held funerals for their men before they left because they did not expect them to return. The death rate was enormous in these silver mines. But this silver enabled particularly the Spanish to occupy a prominent place in the world for a couple hundred years, which they probably would have been unable to do without that silver input. It also generated a century of massive inflation in Europe as silver made its way around the world. A second new form of international commerce was the fur trade. There was, in the 15 and 1600s, what was known as the Little Ice Age, which meant that there was a considerable demand for furs, just for people to keep warm. And North America supplied many of those furs. They also decimated the animal population and they brought disease and alcoholism to many Native American societies. There was a separate fur trade that was focused on Siberia. As the Russians moved eastward over Siberia, they established a tax in furs, beaver pelts and minks and other fur-bearing mammals that were found there, until those animals went largely extinct. In North America, the beaver came close to extinction as the international fur trade decimated the beaver population. And a third major new commercial network was, of course, in the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. And you'll notice that the slave trade was not just transatlantic. There was also a smaller slave trade across the Sahara into the Mediterranean and an Eastern Africa slave trade that took African slaves to India, Arabia, and elsewhere. But most of it went to the Americas, and in the Americas, most of it went to the Caribbean and to Brazil. These are just a few slides that illustrate elements of the slave trade as it occurred in Brazil. Many of the people worked on huge plantations like this. They were subject to immense brutality. And others worked as domestic servants in the homes of Europeans. The slave trade, of course, was horrendous in its consequences. We are still, imagine that, still debating it now. It devastated many African societies and it enriched others. It vastly enriched Europe and North America, and many historians believe that the slave trade was one of the things that enabled the Industrial Revolution to take place in the Americas. Now, moving on to the 19th century, The 19th century, in several ways, deepened the globalization beyond what had occurred before. In the first place, European colonial empires were now established in South and Southeast Asia, the French in Indochina, the British in Australia and New Zealand and India, about a half a dozen different European countries divided up Africa in the late 19th century, so that these areas became now much more integrated into a global economy that was, of course, dominated by Europeans. Furthermore, apart from these empires, new technologies also facilitated a deepening globalization. Machine guns enabled European conquest. Quinine enabled Europeans to remain alive in the tropics. Steam-driven ships and the Suez Canal enabled oceanic transportation. Later on, underwater telegraph lines and railroads connected distant parts of the world. This is a scene from a railroad in India. What this meant, of course, was that the colonies began to produce things that Europeans needed. This is a map of the kind of colonial exports that came from various parts of Africa during the 19th and early 20th centuries. It also meant a massive movement of people. As millions of Europeans came to the Americas, millions of Indians and Southern Chinese went to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean, and a number of people from Northeast Asia and Russia made their way to Manchuria, Siberia, Japan, Central Asia, and so forth. So this vast movement of people was also part of the deepening of globalization in the 19th century. There was a cultural impact as well. Much of European culture, Western education, Western science, European languages, and in Africa, Christianity spread very widely. So this deepening globalization in the 19th century was not only economic, it was cultural as well. Now, quickly moving into the 20th century, where we have been born, anyway, most of us. The first part of the 20th century represented a contraction of earlier globalization. This, of course, took shape in the Great Depression in the West. In the industrialized world, of course, stock prices dropped sharply, investment dried up, world trade contracted by over 60% in a couple of years. In the colonies, the demand for rubber from Southeast Asia fell through the floor as the Depression hit the West. Cocoa farmers in Ghana, which had flourished, now because of the impoverishment in Europe and the Americas, they weren't drinking cocoa, and so many cocoa farmers in Ghana were devastated. Latin American exports shrank very sharply, so that many of the global networks that had been in existence 20 or 30 years earlier contracted and globalization retreated. And to some people, it has suggested that globalization is not inevitable and that it can unravel. More about that in a little bit. However, after World War II, from World War II until more or less the present, there has been a process which historians are calling re-globalization. We have been recovering from and enhancing the kind of globalization that took place in the 19th century. Now, this was fueled in the 20th century by coal, oil, and natural gas. Coal, oil, and natural gas, you see, by 2000 represented the vast amount of energy that was producing the goods that circulated so widely in the world. And this was enabled by all kinds of technological developments. One of them is containerized shipping, but there were many others. Electrical grids, the internal combustion engine changed a great deal in the world. And not only in the West. Automobiles, trucks, jet aircraft, radio, TV, computers, the internet, all of this technology has facilitated an even deeper degree of entanglement in the world of the 20th and 21st centuries. It also coincided with the globalization of industrialization. Before the Second World War, industrialization was largely limited to Western Europe and North America, and to some extent Russia. But now, in the post-war world, industrialization became global, and places like South Korea, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, Vietnam, all of these places developed substantial industrial sectors. This graph shows something of the impact of Chinese industrialization as their per capita gross domestic product went up sharply, particularly from the 1990s on. As a result, world trade expanded exponentially, so did foreign investments, mostly from large transnational corporations that had facilities in many countries. And so, at this point, we arrive at contemporary globalization, the world that we experience on a daily basis. And I wanted to highlight 5 questions about contemporary globalization that have been much debated. First is what drives it? What drives this immense acceleration of global exchange? For some people, it is markets. It is the market economy. In short, it is capitalism. That the impersonal forces of the marketplace drive globalization. Nobody is in control. It just happens. It is inevitable and apparently unstoppable. Clearly, however, technology has been a major factor in this. Transportation, communication, and information technology have certainly facilitated globalization. And so have the policies of governments. Governments established, after the Second World War, a free trade system that has made this globalization possible. So it was perhaps not only the impersonal forces of the marketplace, but the policies of governments that sought to foster this kind of commerce and, to some extent, to regulate it. It is interesting, however, that some countries managed to opt out of this kind of arrangement. The communist countries, first Russia and then China, operated largely outside of the world economy. Their governments were able to isolate themselves. They feared being contaminated by world capitalism, and they wanted nothing to do with it. And so they managed their own industrial development more or less on their own and with their own resources. A second question involves the economic outcomes of globalization, and particularly its impact on equality. Has globalization been associated with an increase or a decrease in global inequality? The answer, it turns out, depends on what you are measuring. If you are measuring income, then pretty clearly globalization has enhanced global inequality. The global north, which represents about 20% of the world's population, controls about 70% of global wealth. This is a new kind of divide in the world. Although the economic growth of China and India has somewhat narrowed this gap. However, if you look not at income, but at what economists call quality of life indicators, things look a lot different. Perhaps the main quality of life indicator from an economic point of view is life expectancy. How long can we expect to live and enjoy this world? And it turns out that globalization has been associated with a considerable increase in human life expectancy all across the world. Now, not exactly the same all across the world, but currently a great number of countries have a life expectancy that is equivalent to that of the United States. The US life expectancy currently is about 79.4 years. Some of us are already beyond that. But it's interesting that Saudi Arabia life expectancy is 79 years, China it is 78, Iran it is 78, Thailand 76, Mexico and Vietnam 75, India 72. So in this sense, if the measure of economic equality is life expectancy, then the degree of inequality has narrowed as globalization unfolded. France, Norway, and Sweden have a life expectancy of 83. So the question of inequality is much debated. It does seem that income inequality can increase while allowing quality of life indicators to also increase as well. A third question that has been raised about globalization has to do with cultural homogeneity. Many people have noticed and feared that globalization has resulted in Americanization, and that the world is becoming more like us. Here are the McDonald's restaurants around the world. The fries that bind us, yes. Sure. And of course, the global popularity of the English language, of modern science, of McDonald's, blue jeans, Barbie dolls, and of course, consumerism has become globalized. The Chinese are enormous consumers and producers of consumer goods. And yet there has been pushback against this kind of thing as well. One of the major examples of that pushback, of course, is Islamic fundamentalism. They have very much pushed back, and one of the interesting ways in which they have done so is to find alternatives to Barbie. These are, I'm forgetting if this is Iran or somewhere else in the Middle East, but a number of Muslim countries resisting the sexual imagery of Ken and Barbie, have developed their own dolls to push back against this. And of course, it shows women in their much more constrained and non-sexualized images. The French, in order to protect their culture, have acted to forbid too many American movies and to forbid headscarves, because too many American movies undermines French movie industry, and headscarves for their Muslim population runs counter to their belief in the equality of women and secularism in the schools. So they have acted to restrict those kinds of things. And there is this interesting phenomenon that is called globalization. Globalization. It's the process whereby foreign practices are adapted to local cultures. For example, in this country, yoga has largely lost its religious associations and become a form of exercise or relaxation. So we practice this, but without the spiritual dimension that it had in its place of origin. And I understand that McDonald's in India and China are now featuring rice-based items on their menu, not just French fries. So a fourth issue that has arisen is the impact of the nation's of globalization on the nation state. Some have argued that the emergence of this global economy powered by transnational corporations has diminished the ability of states to act decisively on their own in the world. Some people have imagined that the nation state has become weakened in relationship to the global economy. And some even imagine a future in which there will be a global economy and a global government structure to go along with it. However, it's not at all clear that the power of the state has seriously been diminished. As I mentioned, some states refused for a time to take part. China withdrew after the communists came into power in 1949, but the Chinese government in 2001 joined the World Trade Organization. So this is a case in which a government was able to take action relative to their country's involvement in the world economy. The British withdrew from the European Union, certainly a step away from globalization. The United States withdrew in 2017 from the Trans-Pacific Agreement that we have worked out with many of the economies of the Pacific region. And currently, of course, Trump's tariffs, I just read today that we are going to impose another 100% increase on tariffs to China. And because the Chinese are restricting the sale of rare earth elements to us. And so the impact of globalization on the sovereignty of nation states is sort of a mixed bag. It has constrained them in some ways, especially for smaller countries. There are transnational corporations with budgets far larger than many small countries, which doesn't give them a lot of leverage negotiating. But on the other hand, larger countries such as China and Britain have exercised their sovereignty in relation to the world economy. And this, of course, raises a final question about the permanence of globalization. There are scholars who believe that it is a permanent, it is a done deal, according to one set of scholars, who said that the question that countries face now is not whether or not to participate, but how to keep up and how to adapt to a continuous and inescapable interactivity in the world. So in that view, globalization is a done deal. It is permanent. It is irreversible. It is the world we live in. But can we imagine globalization unraveling? And some of the things I've already mentioned suggest that possibility. The global recession of 2008 certainly put a dent in world trade. So did the economic contraction that occurred during COVID. The withdrawal of Britain from the European Union also suggested that countries could act to sever their relationships to larger units. Trump has emphasized Americanism, not globalism. This is the American first posture of the Trump administration, as expressed in the tariff wars that are now underway and seem to be increasing. The reaction against immigration, of course, is intended to put a stop to this south to north migration that has been so much a part of the globalized world. And of course, there are all of these assertive nationalisms that have been popping up in much of Europe, Turkey, Iran, China, India, and of course now in here as well. So the debate about the permanence of globalization continues, as does almost everything else connected with globalization. So let me stop here and see if you have thoughts or questions.
Well, I'd like to comment. I think those of us, I grew up in the 1950s, and that was an era when America was predominant in the world.
Yes.
The Marshall Plan had, rejuvenated the economies of Western Europe. We had a so-called bipolar world, although there was a third world, which we didn't really pay much attention to, but it was there. So you had this notion that America was first.
Mhm.
You had the Russians were second, perhaps equal, but not really.
Mhm.
We were in a race with them in all sorts of forms, technologically, militarily, politically. And then it all changed after the fall of the Soviet Union. And we saw what really was going on over there. It was not the equal of America.
Right.
And the rest of the world then, at the same time, rose up,
Yep.
as you were mentioning,
Yep.
in economic and political vitality. So the whole bubble, I call it a bubble that we lived in. It was very unusual historically, the 1950s, post-war World War II era.
Yes.
And there's no reason to expect that kind of a thing to recur again. I think it was a response to a situation that had to be responded to, but I doubt that we'll ever have anything like that again. What do you think?
No, I agree. It seems to me that well, it seems pretty clear that the United States is in decline as a great power. It's not finished, but our internal divisions suggest that, relatively speaking, and particularly in comparison to China, the US is in decline, that there are other centers of power. There's the European Union, there is China, of course, there is India, there is Brazil. So I suspect that we are in for a multipolar situation.
But I will comment on that too. Technologically, America is still predominant. We have the 5 biggest internet companies right here in America. They're transnational,
Yes.
but they're here.
Yes.
And we have the most creative technology right here in California, among other places. So I don't see the rest of the world catching up in that sense. So that's an inequality that'll probably continue, especially now with AI taking over. So I don't think that America is necessarily in decline. Parts of it maybe are, but the whole country I don't think is.
Okay, well, we shall see. Yes.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I was very intrigued by your you're presenting both income inequality and quality of life equality.
Yes.
Because I've never seen that actually presented side to side. And it's actually very interesting because it raises a couple of points. That is to say, how much income is enough? Just because somebody else was successful and built a company or whatever it was, and they're a billionaire. If you're okay and you have what you need and you're healthy and so on, you have enough to eat. Why is that such a terrible thing that there's income inequality? I mean, everybody would love to have lots of money. It's not the solution to everything. And I think a lot of what people have gotten used to also is just cheap goods from China, so that you buy more and you have a lot of junk in your house. You have like 4 sets of pots and how many kitchen appliances, but how much do you really need?
Just go to Costco.
Yeah, if there was a little bit more pushback against all this cheap goods and all this globalization, such that there was more of a balance. So maybe my set of pots would cost more, but I'd only have 1 set because that's really all I need. And I think that the using income, and I think a lot of the very extremists in our society all over the world, yell and scream about income equality, but it's really, I think your quality of life, I think, has definitely improved and lifespan, after, in the past couple hundred years. And I think, if you want to, you don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, because that's not going to help everybody. It's just going to make you feel more virtuous. And I could cite, New York politics to as an example of that. But I think it's very interesting that you presented that, and I think that should be presented a lot more in.
And there are other
Yeah.
indications besides longevity, but literacy, for example, especially literacy for women, has vastly improved in the last 50, 75 years.
But I will comment on that too.
And infant mortality has declined sharply around the world.
There was a very interesting article by, who was it wrote it that you just gave me, about literacy and people reading books. Who was it?
Oh, somebody in the Free Press,
Okay.
some professor from Princeton.
The point I'm making is that not as many people are reading books like we have right here compared to the past. The Generation Z, for example, is more involved in screen time than in opening a book. When we went to school, we learned to interpret themes, to learn how to read things critically, to compare comparative literature. We had very, very strict teachers of English and literature. I don't see that now in what I see the kids getting. They're not getting that. They're getting it all from memes and from TikTok and emojis and and videos. So, do people really read as much anymore? That's the key point of civilized behavior, is learning how to read critically. I don't see it.
Well,
And that's the fall of civilization if that continues.
here's another take on something that you raised earlier. There was a very interesting article in the New York Times this past week called "The West is Lost." And the argument was that since the Enlightenment of the 18th century, progress has become our secular religion. The idea that everything is improving. And what the article suggests is that we have come up against the limits of that, and that therefore people are experiencing loss. There is vast ecological loss as species are decimated, as the climate changes. There is economic loss in the rust belts of the Midwest and elsewhere. There is educational loss of the kind that you are pointing to. And he argues that the growth of right-wing populism in this country and elsewhere in Western Europe is the product of this loss, that we were not raised to expect loss. We were raised to think more and better rather than less and worse.
That's the American way.
Yes. But what if we have run up against the limits of progress? How can we adjust? The populist solutions argue in favor of a return to something that they saw as better. So Trump wants us to go back to the 1950s. A lot of people want women to be in the homes. We want to return to coal, even as coal is becoming less economically viable. It was a very thoughtful article that raised the question of America's, and not just America, but it was about the Western world's encounter with limitations and the kind of sense of loss. People have lost identity, they have lost income, they have lost a sense of men sometimes in the face of feminism have lost something of their masculine privileges. So the article suggested that it was how we deal with loss and our ability to integrate loss into our understanding of the world.
But I will argue again that that's not the only thing that we're talking about. We're talking about in history, in Western history, we've had ups and downs of progress. Right after World War I, for example, there was tremendous pessimism about the future of the West.
Yes.
And then we recovered. They had that, the Depression, then World War II, and then you got 1950s. So it's in cycles. I don't see that we're all going to go downhill, until we're all medieval again. I don't see that.
Okay.
Well, no, I'm just thinking about the big transition that we're facing is with AI.
Yeah.
And it's being discussed a lot in terms of work for human beings, whether we're facing huge loss that way or whether there's a gain and having more leisure time. They've always spoken of that, and what would we do with that time, and how essential is it for human beings to work and feel productive? And so this is an essential transition that's happening. Seems there'll be a lot more lost in that. And that's just a readjustment. It could be, a transition.
Ron, I'd like to hear your perspective on globalization as to how it affects nationalism and the tendency of humans to go to war. I always think that once I get to see people in other areas of the world and see that there are people like me, that it should somehow evolve into one global family or something. I mean, that's maybe my naivete about that. But how has it nationalism and globalization kind of played on each other?
The theory of globalization early on was that global interconnectedness, economic interconnectedness, would reduce the incentive for war. Why go to war if you could trade? War is a zero-sum game. Trade is not. That seems not to have come to pass. So I think that the naive notion that if you get to know your neighbors better, you will like them more is not necessarily.
I wouldn't want to drop a bomb on their head. Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in a competitive economy, and capitalism is based on competition, yes.
First of all, thank you very much. This is a great talk. So. I do have a question also. I'm wondering, have there been examples of reverse globalization in history, maybe even smaller examples, so it doesn't have to be the degree that we have it today, but in particular thinking of like the Roman Empire, which of course was this gigantic empire, and there was trade throughout, but at some point it fell. And so I'm wondering if there are examples like that one or others, and also what was the impact of the quality of life or other metrics to the
Well, the Roman Empire is a good example of the contraction of connectivity. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and the date that's most often given is 476. Of course, the Eastern Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years, but the Western Roman Empire did pretty much collapse. Roman authority was no longer, population dropped. Europe, in a sense, lost civilization. It was reduced to what we refer to as feudalism, which is a highly decentralized and militarized system of life. And it was associated with an immense contraction of international commerce, with poverty, with the absence of effective centralized government, until the new nations, somewhere around 1,000 or 1,200, began to slowly to take shape. You know, France and England, and Italian, German, Dutch, Swedish states began to take shape roughly around 1,200 or so, and ushered in what we now have, and that is a system of competing nation states. And of course, more recently, the Great Depression was an example of the temporary retreat of globalization. Let me think, other sorts of.
Can we use, I'm thinking more extreme, like the Roman Empire example, and that's the Great Depression. Can we use that to make any kinds of projections for what we could expect, or is it just, is everything too different than what we experience today?
We desperately want history to be predictive. And we want to think that the lessons of history hold insights for us. To be honest, most professional historians do not. They are more impressed by the surprises of history rather than the predictive. You know, at the beginning of the 20th century or in the middle of World War I, who would have predicted that France and Germany would be allies now? You know.
But at the very least, if we did see a reversal, we would expect a decline in our quality of life. That may.
Yes, given that our economies are so interconnected, and you know, we're seeing this now with the tariff wars that Trump has set in motion. The Dow dropped 800 points after he announced a 100% increase on Chinese tariffs the next day. So if it's not in retreat, it is certainly not stable.
Thank you.
As a historian, I don't know if you devote much of your professional life in the past to the history of communism, but what is the current appeal, do you think, of communism to young people, given the disastrous history in the past? And currently, in terms of, you know,
Socialism.
fanaticism and stuff like that, and the disastrous economic results of communism. Why is
I don't think there's much enthusiasm for Soviet-style communism.
What about socialism?
Well, socialism, democratic socialism of the kind that what's his name in New York, Mondale, and Bernie Sanders, has been prominent in Europe for a long time.
Sweden abandoned it after a while. Sweden has the Norwegian, Sweden governments have abandoned it to some extent. They retreated from it.
Yes.
No more cradle to grave stuff because they can't afford it.
Yes,
A
and
question.
the immigration question as well.
There's one
Which kind of brings me to my question, which was, I walked in late, I didn't know you were speaking. But did you speak to the Global South and the lifting up of agency to how we kind of generically define the Global South, not just Brazil and Latin America, but did you speak to?
Well, the Global South is a more recent term for what used to be called the Third World. You know, the former colonies, and most of them are in the South, so that's the origin of the term. sometimes they're referred to as developing countries.
And lifting that market and that social perspective up into the globalization conversation as we see shifts happening.
Well, it's interesting that the so-called North-South divide has become a prominent issue internationally. And this is not entirely new. In the 70s, the countries of the Global South got together and devised a plan for sharing the wealth more broadly. There was a term for that, and I'm forgetting what it was, but that went nowhere. National sovereignty and independent nation states make it difficult for the Global South to present a united front. Does a country like China, generally considered part of the Global South, although maybe not for long, have much in common with the banana republics of Central America? Do the oil producers of the Middle East have much in common with African countries who have a couple of crops or minerals that they export? So that the divisions within the Global South make it difficult for them to present a united front and to negotiate equally with the industrialized countries.
And I wonder if we're seeing rather a haphazard balancing of power and negotiation rather than a united, but there are definitely, I mean, China's leveraging itself sometimes on the back of the Global South relationships.
Yes.
Which is what is kind of recreating this perception of the end of progress for the global privileged West, however we want to frame it.
Well, there has been resistance from the Global South about environmental concerns from the Global North.
Right.
On the grounds that you've got your wealth and now you want to prevent us from getting it.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult situation.
We're in a balance.
How can yes. I don't have a grand solution to this problem, but as you say, I think it is a haphazard situation. And the United Nations is no longer a really effective mechanism for handling this kind of thing. And I think at the beginning, it was hoped that the United Nations would be a forum where these kind of things could be hashed out and reasonable compromises emerged at.
Which then arises in me the inquiry into the Finnish president at present, Alexander Stubb, kind of trying to sell a narrative of the perspective of his decade of academia, where he left politics, to study, well, how do we approach this question of the chaos and the disequilibrium? Where are the structures? And I mean, I was listening to his address to the UN, and he's really trying to emphasize, can we get more agency with the Security Council to read from African countries, from Brazil, or so just hearing him consider these notions and intellectualize it from 10 years of being able to rest in an academic setting rather than on the political stage has been, when I contract a little around the notion that progress is reversing or we're coming to a halt or there's fear about contraction, it's been helpful for me to look to kind of these voices that are considering a broader picture, de-emphasizing the leaning on history. I mean, I think we have to look to it and consider it, de-emphasizing the emotion over emotional caught up in, especially in our politics here with the current administration, and not forgetting about the fact that the future is always comes some way or another. There's going to be a future, and then we can't determine it, but it's still there. We need to give it space to be itself too.
Amen. Sir.
Two items. First, sometimes the facts on the ground change faster than our language to describe it. For example, we're ostensibly a capitalist country, but from the very beginning of the republic, the government has intervened heavily in the economy.
Yeah.
So it's another false to say we're capitalist. Like manner, China is ostensibly communist, but clearly that's
Yes,
over.
yes.
And now Russia, for all practical purposes, czarist Russia. So, but that's not what interests me now. Well, if we think of the current tariff world as a system, and you have previously noted that empires rise and fall in relation to other forces becoming equal or more powerful. In like manner, if we think of the current system as, Trump's tariff world, it contains inherent weaknesses, economic. I'm going to suggest that will be undermined by when the other people get together and just do away with these tariffs and we go back to globalization. It's yet to happen.
Yeah.
That's my prediction.
Okay, okay. So Trumpism will collapse and we will.
Well, Trumpism is inherently flawed in the sense that everything becomes more expensive. I mean, the Great Depression was brought on by trade barriers,
Mhm.
and we're about to have a new one perhaps.
Yeah.
And then that collapse should be replaced by something more reasonable.
Mhm.
Like trading with other people. Let's hope so.
I think we can expect perfection in world politics and in national politics. And so we have to stop listening to people who want to pontificate about world peace at a universal level through an organization like the United Nations, which has shown itself to be inept at this point. It wasn't in the beginning, but it is now. And so what I'm suggesting is that what's going to happen is we're going to have power centers, balances of power. And America is still fairly powerful. China is powerful. Europe is powerful. Other countries are going to get powerful. We're going to have a balance of power. Now we hope that won't lead to what happened in World War I, where you had so much rivalry that they started to fight each other and destroy each other. And I think in the nuclear age, there's enough checks and balances put in place to stop that kind of stuff. But maybe not. I don't know. But this is our biggest fear, is that there can be balances of power that then end up competing at the level militarily of trying to annihilate each other.
Yeah.
And you can say what you want about, what's going on right now, but at least we're not fighting we're trying not to fight any more damn wars.
Well, there was about 100 years during the 19th century, from the end of Napoleon until the First World War, when the European system was one of a balance of power, and they depended on that balance of power to prevent the outbreak of war. And for quite a long time, it did, until it didn't.
But it was personalities that led to that too.
Oh, well, that's a very complicated question. What led to World War I? But there's also been debate about the relative stability of a balance of power with multipolar centers of power versus the bipolar system of the Cold War. And there is at least an argument that suggests that a bipolar system is more stable.
We'll never get back to it, will we?
No, we probably won't. But the example of what happened in Europe between 1814 and 1914 is an interesting conundrum for us to consider.
Europe between 1814 and 1914 was not all that peaceful.
I'm sorry, it
Was not all that peaceful. You
Well,
had the Franco-Prussian War,
Franco-Prussian
you had
War.
the Crimean War, you
Mhm.
had they went to war with the Turks.
And there was endless war in the colonies.
Yeah.
But what I will say is this. Europe, up until 30 years ago, saw the longest period of time where there was actually no shooting going on in Europe.
Mhm.
From the end of World War II to 2022.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I think caused it and why the Germans and the French are suddenly getting along is the creation of NATO. And I don't think NATO gets the credit that it deserves, because once NATO came in with Article 5, the United States is sitting on the sideline. Nobody, the French were not gonna fight the Germans. The Germans were not gonna slug it out with the Italians or anybody else, because there's the United States is sitting there saying, you can't do it.
2004. Oh.
And actually, but
Gene Hack.
multipolar or bipolar,
I think it doesn't make much difference.
Yeah.
There is a wearisomeness to history, though. The endless proliferation of wars, which at some level of abstraction seems absurd. There is something flawed about us as human beings that means that we resort to this kind of conflict with such frequency. And somebody made a comment here about looking for alternatives. There is this lovely Chinese poem from the 8th century that I have perhaps mentioned before. It says this: the country in ruins, rivers and mountains remain. So that is one alternative. The country in ruins, politics proceeds as it has for thousands of years, but the rivers and mountains are still there. And that gives us all another alternative. We don't have to focus all of our lives on history, on politics, on economics, but we can return to the mountains and the rivers and the ocean.
Yes.
Thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank you.